The results of the new genetic health initiative were supposed to bring clarity, not chaos. For weeks, Forrester Creations had been buzzing with cautious optimism as the company launched a comprehensive hereditary screening program for its executives and employees. The plan had been born out of necessity. Eric Forrester's declining health had stirred quiet panic within the family. What began as a medical precaution quickly became a movement toward transparency, a symbolic gesture of unity. Every family member had agreed to participate. The irony was cruel. The one test meant to heal the family ended up tearing it apart. The day the results came back began like any other at Forrester. Ridge arrived early, as usual, carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had built an empire on discipline and design. He moved through the office with habitual ease, greeting staff, reviewing sketches, checking on fabrics. The air was light, almost hopeful. Forrester Creations was preparing for its winter collection, and even amid the weight of Eric's illness, the show had to go on. What Ridge didn't know was that on the 24th floor, inside the HR division, a technician was staring in confusion at 2 lines of data that didn't match any expected pattern. The technician's supervisor was called, then the lab director. And by the time Ridge finished his morning coffee, a secret that had been buried for decades had begun to surface. Dylan wasn't supposed to be part of the story at all. She was one of the newer hires, a young art instructor who had joined Forrester's creative development team 2 years ago. Talented but discreet, she had a quiet way of moving through the company, respected by her peers, admired by the interns, but largely invisible to the power players. When the genetic health survey was announced, she had volunteered immediately, half out of curiosity and half out of a sense of belonging. She had grown up without a father, her mother's vague explanations wrapped in shame and half-truths. Maybe she thought the test would help her understand something about her own history. She could never have imagined it would rewrite someone else's. The lab report arrived at Ridge's office in a sealed envelope, bearing his name and a standard confidentiality notice. Inside, along with his own results, was a notification: genetic overlap identified with another participant. Confirmation of immediate biological relation. The second name on the page was Dylan Hayes. Ridge blinked once, then again, rereading it, his breath catching as though the letters themselves were alive and clawing at his mind. For a long moment, the world narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat. Then came the memories, fragmented, scattered, dangerous. Years ago, before Brooke, before the latest cycle of marriage and forgiveness, there had been a night at an industry event in Milan. He remembered a woman, beautiful, intelligent, soft-spoken. She had been part of an art collective that collaborated briefly with Forrester. Her name had been Marla Hayes. She'd vanished after the project ended, moving overseas, unreachable. Ridge had never known she was pregnant. And now, decades later, her daughter worked for him, unknowingly carrying the same blood, the same restless, creative fire. Shock gave way to guilt. Guilt to dread. Because Ridge understood what this meant, not just for him, but for Brooke. When Brooke learned the truth, it didn't come from Ridge. It came from whispers in the hallway, from a young designer too stunned to stay silent. The words had spread like perfume, soft at first, then suffocating. By the time Brooke reached Ridge's office, her hands were shaking. "Tell me it isn't true," she said, her voice trembling. Ridge didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The silence between them was louder than any confession. Brooke's eyes filled, the tears not of surprise, but of recognition. "You promised me," she whispered. "You promised this was the last time you would ever break me." For years, their love had survived betrayals, separations, the relentless pull of fate that kept throwing them together only to tear them apart. Brooke had forgiven him more than once: affairs, emotional entanglements, impulsive mistakes. But this was different. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a lie that had lived longer than their marriage. The daughter of another woman, working within the company she and Ridge had built, right under her nose, it was too much. Ridge tried to explain, but how does one explain something they didn't know? "I didn't know, Brooke. I swear to you, I didn't." But his words, true as they were, sounded hollow. You didn't know, she repeated, almost to herself. But you made her part of this family's world without realizing she already was. The next days unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. Every Forrester lunch meeting, every quiet conversation, every glance in the hall carried the weight of scandal. Eric's health had already made the family fragile, and now this revelation fractured it completely. Thomas and Steffi reacted differently. Steffi, pragmatic as ever, saw it as another test of endurance. We can fix this, she told Ridge, though even she sounded unsure. Thomas, on the other hand, was furious. You let her work here? He shouted. You put her in our company, with our family, without even knowing who she was? The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Thomas himself had been no stranger to deception. But this was a different kind of betrayal, the kind that redrew the boundaries of blood itself. For Dylan, the revelation was equally devastating. The HR director had called her into a private meeting, and when she left, pale and wordless, the office rumor mill erupted. She avoided Ridge for days, but eventually she couldn't. When they met in his office, the atmosphere was unbearable, half confession, half confrontation. You're my father, she said finally, breaking the silence. Ridge's throat tightened. I didn't know, he said again, helplessly. I didn't know about you. Dylan's eyes glistened, but there was no anger in them, only exhaustion. I didn't either, she said quietly. Until now, I didn't even know what I was missing. Their relationship began awkwardly, cautiously, as both tried to make sense of the bond forced upon them by science. Ridge saw flashes of himself in her precision, her eye for color, the way she leaned over her sketches with quiet focus. But the more he saw, the heavier his guilt became. Brooke's absence haunted him. She had moved out temporarily, retreating to her sister Donna's house. Her perfume still lingered on his clothes, her words still echoed in his mind. Every time I believe we're whole again, the past finds a new way to destroy us. Brooke's pain was not just jealousy, it was existential. For decades, her love for Ridge had been her anchor, her identity. They had survived affairs, wars of loyalty, even the weight of their own fame. She had always believed that love, no matter how flawed, could be rebuilt. But this revelation shook that belief to its core. At night, lying awake in Donna's guest room, she replayed every moment of their history, every reunion, every promise, every "this time will be different." How could she keep forgiving a man whose life kept writing new betrayals for her to endure? Her grief soon hardened into resolve. She began to distance herself from the Forrester name, taking on charity work, speaking to the press less often. But her withdrawal only made Ridge more desperate. He sent flowers, letters, even an old sketch he had made of her decades ago, a symbol of their beginnings. Each attempt went unanswered. When he finally visited her, she refused to let him in. You always say you didn't mean for it to happen, she said through the door. But somehow it always happens. Maybe it's not about meaning. Maybe it's who you are. The scandal deepened when Dylan's mother, Marla Hayes, returned unexpectedly from Europe. Her reappearance reignited every question the family wanted buried. Marla confirmed what the DNA test had already proven. Ridge was indeed Dylan's father, but her tone carried no malice. He didn't know, she told reporters. Neither of us did. We were young. The timing was complicated. But her calm only enraged Brooke further. Watching footage of Marla's press statement, Brooke whispered, "Of course she forgives him. Everyone forgives Ridge Forrester." Meanwhile, the media frenzy took on a life of its own. The hidden heir of Forrester Creations read one headline, while another speculated, "New daughter, new dynasty?" Investors grew nervous, clients grew curious, and through it all, Eric's health worsened. From his hospital bed, the patriarch watched the family splinter again, the empire he had built now balanced on the edge of scandal. He called Ridge to his side one evening. "You're repeating my mistakes," he said weakly. "You think love forgives everything. It doesn't. Sometimes, it just forgets until it remembers." Ridge held his father's hand, speechless. As weeks turned into months, the emotional fallout settled into something quieter, but no less painful. Dylan stayed at Forrester Creations, though she avoided family functions. Ridge insisted she continue her work, arguing that she deserved the opportunity she had earned. But her presence was a constant reminder of what had been lost. Brooke's chair at family dinners remained empty. Steffi tried to mediate, telling her father that time would heal things, but even she began to wonder whether Brooke could ever return after so many betrayals. In the midst of this chaos, something unexpected began to happen. Dylan, in her quiet resilience, began to bring out a different side of Ridge, a gentler one. He taught her not just about design, but about legacy, about the intangible weight of the Forrester name. She, in turn, forced him to confront what that name had cost him. In one of their late-night studio sessions, she said softly, "Maybe you can't keep love and loyalty at the same time. Maybe that's why you keep losing both." Ridge didn't answer, but the truth of her words lingered long after she left the room. Brooke eventually returned to the mansion, but not as his wife. She came to see Eric, not Ridge. Her visits were brief, polite, distant. And yet, each encounter with Ridge was electric with unspoken longing. They would pass in the hallway, their eyes meeting for a moment too long before she turned away. For the first time in their long, entangled history, Brooke didn't cry. She simply smiled sadly and said, "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just tired." As spring came, Eric's condition stabilized slightly, and Forrester Creations prepared for its next collection, one co-designed by Ridge and Dylan. The fashion world buzzed with anticipation, dubbing it the reunion line, though those inside the company knew it was more of an elegy than a celebration. The show debuted to thunderous applause. On stage, under the blinding lights, Ridge stood beside his daughter as the crowd rose in ovation. For a fleeting moment, pride eclipsed guilt. But when he turned to the audience, searching for Brooke's face, she wasn't there. Later that night, as he walked alone through the darkened studio, Ridge found a single white rose lying on his drafting table. Attached was a note in Brooke's handwriting. "You've built something beautiful, Ridge. Maybe now you can finally see what I saw in you all along." He stood there for a long time, the note trembling in his hand. Around him, the sketches and fabric swatches seemed to blur, their colors fading into one another. The world he had built was intact, but the life he had wanted, the love that had defined him, was gone. Dylan found him there hours later, staring at the empty space where Brooke had stood for decades. "You can't fix everything," she said softly. Ridge nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I know, but maybe I can stop breaking it." In the end, the family didn't fall apart completely, it changed. Eric lived long enough to see a fragile piece return, to watch his son and granddaughter rebuild something honest from the wreckage. Brooke moved forward with grace, her heart scarred but steady. And Ridge, for the first time in his life, began to live not for forgiveness, but for truth. Yet sometimes, late at night, he would walk through the empty Forrester showroom and imagine her voice behind him, soft and familiar. "This was the last time, Ridge. Don't make me write." He would smile sadly, touch the white rose pressed between the pages of his sketchbook, and whisper into the silence, "No more promises. Just love, if it finds its way back." Confrontation began on a day that was supposed to bring peace. For weeks, Ridge Forrester had felt the tightening grip of a secret that refused to stay buried. It wasn't the kind of secret that could be managed or explained away. It was the kind that reshaped everything it touched, the kind that rewrote the moral structure of a man's life. He had lived with it for years, convincing himself that silence was mercy, that some truths were too destructive to speak aloud. But when Brooke began to sense the cracks in his calm, and Dylan's questions about the past grew too specific to ignore, the illusion of control shattered. Ridge had spent a lifetime designing perfection on fabric, but now he was standing before two women he loved in entirely different ways, holding nothing but the ugliness of his truth. The room was quiet when he began. Brooke stood by the window, arms crossed, her face pale but resolute. Dylan sat across from him, confusion in her eyes. She hadn't been called to this meeting expecting revelation. Ridge took a breath, but the words seemed to cut him on their way out. "Before you hear it from anyone else," he said softly, "you need to know for me. There was someone else years ago. Her name was Serena." The name itself seemed to ripple through the air, drawing a visible tremor from Brooke. She didn't move, didn't speak, just waited, her silence heavier than accusation. Ridge went on, his voice roughened by guilt. "It was during a time when we weren't together, Brooke. You and I had fallen apart again. I was lost. I made a mistake. Serena worked for Forrester. She was in marketing then, part of the design presentations. We'd been working late one night, talking about campaigns, about how everything in my life seemed to be slipping away. I didn't plan for anything to happen, but it did." Dylan looked from one to the other, the realization sinking slowly, painfully. Serena, her mother. The missing chapter of her life that had never been explained. The faint sadness that had shadowed her mother's eyes when she'd asked about her father. All the fragments began to align with an awful symmetry. Ridge continued, unable to meet either woman's gaze. "When Serena left the company, I thought it was because of work. But she left because she was pregnant.
She didn't tell me."
I didn't know until he swallowed hard, as if saying it would make it too real. Until the DNA test came back. Brooke turned then, finally, her voice breaking into the space like a blade through glass. "You mean to tell me that while I was trying to hold us together, while I was forgiving you for every betrayal, every moment of weakness, you were hiding another one? And this time, it wasn't the one-night mistake. You fathered a child." He reached for her, but she stepped back sharply.
"Don't," she said.
"Don't touch me." Her eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. "You could have told me, Ridge. You could have trusted me." Ridge's voice trembled. "I didn't know how. Serena left, and I tried to move forward. When Dylan joined the company, I didn't connect it. I didn't see the resemblance, not until the tests. By then, I couldn't bring myself to destroy what little piece we had left. I was wrong, Brooke. I thought silence would protect you." "Protect me?" she repeated, almost laughing. "You think lies protect anyone?" Dylan sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to rage, but the words wouldn't come. All she could think was how absurdly familiar this felt, watching two people she admired fall apart over something she never asked for. "You kept me a secret," she said finally, her voice trembling but steady. "All my life, I wondered who my father was. My mother wouldn't say. And now I find out that the man I've worked for, the man I've looked up to, the one who made me believe I could belong here, he's the same man who couldn't even admit I existed." Ridge turned toward her, his face stricken. "Dylan, please." "No," she cut in. "You don't get to please me. You had decades to do the right thing." She rose, her chair scraping sharply against the floor. "You say you didn't know, but even when you did, you still lied. You let me walk into this building every day without telling me who I was. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Brooke's tears finally broke, silent and uncontrollable. She moved toward the door, whispering, "I can't listen to this anymore." But Ridge stepped in front of her. "Brooke, please, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to understand. It was years ago. I was broken and Serena was—" "Don't," she said, her voice hardening. "Don't make her your excuse." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "You were always broken, Ridge. That's been your reason for everything, every mistake, every woman, every betrayal. You say you love me, but you love the idea of being forgiven more." Her words hit him harder than a slap. He stood there, speechless, as she left the room. The sound of the door closing felt like the end of something sacred, something that had survived too much to die quietly. After she was gone, Ridge sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Dylan remained standing, arms crossed, trembling with conflicting emotions, anger, grief, confusion. "You've hurt her," she said finally. "And you've hurt me. Maybe you didn't mean to, but you did." "I know," Ridge whispered. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." But Dylan wasn't sure anything could make it right. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Brooke's absence from Forrester Creations was immediate and deafening. Meetings were rescheduled, press statements revised, rumors controlled but never silenced. Steffi tried to manage the damage, but even she couldn't hide the tension. "The press will eat this alive," she told her father. "You need to get ahead of it before it destroys us all." But Ridge barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, on Brooke, on Dylan, on Serena's ghost still lingering in every unspoken sentence. Dylan, meanwhile, avoided him entirely. She moved her workspace to another department, claiming it was temporary. But everyone knew it wasn't. When Ridge tried to reach out, she shut him down. "You've already taken enough," she told him one afternoon when he cornered her in the design studio. "You don't get to take my piece, too." He wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes silenced him. It was the same look Brooke had worn the day she walked out, a look of love that had finally turned into self-preservation. As the weeks passed, Ridge began to understand that forgiveness wasn't something he could beg for. It was something he would have to earn by living differently. He started visiting Eric more often, finding comfort in his father's quiet wisdom. Eric, frail but lucid, listened without judgment. "You made a mistake, son," he said softly. "But mistakes don't define us. What we do afterward does." Ridge nodded, but inside he wondered whether there was any afterward left to build. Brooke, for her part, had retreated into solitude. She spent her mornings walking the beach, her evenings surrounded by silence. Friends reached out, Katie, Donna, even Hope, but she kept her pain close, like an old wound she didn't dare expose to the air. When Ridge's letters began arriving, she read them but didn't reply. He wrote of regret, of memories, of love that refused to die. His words were poetic, desperate, honest. And yet, every letter felt like another plea to undo what couldn't be undone. Dylan, caught between the two worlds she now embodied, found herself drawn into a crisis of identity. She was a Forrester by blood, but it didn't feel like belonging. The name carried too much history, too many scars. When she looked at Ridge, she saw not just a father she never had, but a man haunted by his own contradictions, capable of beauty and betrayal in equal measure. Their first real conversation after the fallout happened late one night, in the empty design room. Ridge had come to check on a project. Dylan had stayed late, sketching quietly. They both hesitated when they saw each other, then slowly began to speak. Ridge apologized again, but this time there was no defensiveness in his tone, no self-pity. "I can't change what I did," he said. "But I can be your father now, if you'll let me." Dylan looked at him for a long time before answering. "You don't get to be my father because you want to feel better about yourself," she said. "You get to be my father if you start showing up, not just for me, but for everyone you keep hurting." The words cut, but they also freed something inside him. For the first time, Ridge began to listen instead of trying to explain. Brooke returned to the Forrester offices months later, not because of Ridge, but because of Eric. His health had worsened, and she wanted to be there for the man who had always been her family's anchor. When she saw Ridge again, their eyes met across the hallway, full of everything that still lingered between them. Love, pain, history. They spoke briefly, carefully. There were no accusations this time, only acknowledgement. "You look stronger," he said quietly. Brooke smiled faintly. "Maybe I finally learned to stop rebuilding what's meant to stay broken." He nodded. "I never wanted to lose you. You never stopped trying," she replied gently. That was the problem. And then she walked away, not with bitterness, but with peace. In time, Forrester Creations found its rhythm again. Dylan proved herself an extraordinary designer, her work infused with raw emotion that audiences felt but couldn't name. Ridge began mentoring her, not out of guilt, but out of pride. Their relationship remained fragile, but real, two imperfect people learning to build something from the wreckage of truth. Late one evening, long after the lights had dimmed, Ridge stood alone in his office, gazing at an old photograph of him and Brooke from years ago. His reflection in the glass seemed older, wearier, but also strangely calmer. Behind him, Dylan entered quietly. "You still love her, don't you?" she asked. He didn't turn around.
"I always will," he said.
But sometimes love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let someone be free. Dylan smiled sadly. "Maybe that's the first honest thing you've ever said." Ridge chuckled softly, a sound edged with melancholy. "Maybe it is." As she left, the door closed gently behind her, leaving him with the faint hum of the city outside and the weight of a life finally laid bare. Ridge had built his career on the illusion of perfection, but it was in his flaws, in his failures, in his confessions, that he finally became human. And though Brooke might never return, and though forgiveness might never come, he understood now that truth, once spoken, was its own kind of